A decade or so ago, North Korea's nuclear intentions were kept in check by a thinly veiled diplomatic facade, where they created the appearance of peace, cooperation, and non-aggression. However, as the world welcomed the new year 2024, North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong Un dropped a bombshell on his diplomatic charade. North Korea is planning on raising the nuclear stakes. In January, Kim warned the world that war is a realistic possibility and has pledged to build more nuclear weapons in 2024, signaling a turbulent year ahead. Now, if you know anything about Kim, his bombastic threats are as much a tradition as New Year's resolutions. But why is the alarm being rung louder this time? The answer is simple. Seasoned interpreters of North Korea's theatrics are seeing some disturbing signs. In a widely discussed 38 North essay published on January 11, 2024, influential scholars Robert Carlin and Siegfried Hecker say they believe that, like his grandfather in 1950, Kim Jong Un has made a strategic decision to go to war. Sure, this declaration is alarming in and of itself, but the fact that it comes from Hecker, a distinguished nuclear scientist who's visited North Korea on many occasions, and Carlin, former leading North Korea analyst for the CIA, makes it bone-chilling. Yes, the sentiment might seem overly dramatic. In fact, Hecker and Carlin label their statement as such in their essay. But even if we tone down the dramatics, the outcome remains the same. A nuclear war might loom on the horizon, and it might be much closer than we dare to admit. As Robert Gallucci, the chief negotiator during the first North Korean nuclear crisis in 1994, puts it, we should at least entertain the thought that nuclear war could break out in Northeast Asia in 2024. So one thing is for sure, the stakes have never been higher in the geopolitical tinderbox that is North Korea. But this leaves us with one crucial question: why is North Korea preparing for nuclear war? Of course, other questions beg for answers in the unfolding drama of North Korea's nuclear brinksmanship. For instance, what makes Hecker, Carlin, and Gallucci and others ring the alarm with such urgency? What are the possible triggers for this nuclear war? And in this dystopian scenario, is there a path to peace? With so many questions in the air, let's begin to try to answer them. We'll start by laying some groundwork. What makes so many scholars and experts worried that the actions of a single nation might unleash the horrors of a modern-day nuclear war? As is the case for most questions in this video, there are multiple answers, or in this case, multiple factors, contributing to this heightened concern. First up, Kim Jong Un's escalating rhetoric. Kim's no stranger to provocative language and extravagant threats. However, the recent shift from vague posturing to explicit warning of a nuclear war is what has everyone worried. But what's exactly been said so far? Honestly, a better question might be, what hasn't been said so far? Here's a quick rundown of Kim's most worrying statements concerning war. During the 9th plenary meeting of the 8th Central Committee of the Workers' Party of Korea, taking place during the last week of 2023, Kim vowed that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or DPRK, would thoroughly annihilate the US and South Korea if provoked. If those two words send shivers down your spine, wait till you hear the whole statement. If the enemy opts for a military confrontation and provocation against the DPRK, our army should deal a deadly blow to thoroughly annihilate them by mobilizing all the toughest means and potentialities without a moment's hesitation, said Kim. The heightened state of alert makes more sense with every passing word, doesn't it? Kim used that same meeting to label the neighboring South Korea as a hemiplegic malformation and colonial subordinate state and deem its society tainted by Yankee culture. That's probably why his plan in the event of a conflict is to suppress the whole territory of South Korea. This warlike rhetoric continued into 2024, this time aided by one of the most powerful members of Kim Jong Un's regime, his sister, Kim Yo-jong. As ruthless as her brother, she didn't hold back, saying, "I make myself clear once again that the safety catch of the trigger of the Korean People's Army had already been slipped." Just a few weeks earlier, Kim Jong Un declared South Korea the principal enemy of the North, officially abandoning the long-standing proposition of peacefully reuniting the Korean peninsula. Kim added that North Korea doesn't want a nuclear war, but has no intention of avoiding it. If incendiary statements were all there was to it, perhaps the international community could dismiss them as Kim being Kim, as it already had done on numerous occasions. However, this time Kim is letting his actions speak even louder than words. The country has conducted more than 100 missile tests since 2022. This brings us to another reason experts believe a nuclear war might be imminent: the changes in North Korea's constitution regarding the country's nuclear program. These changes are by no means new developments for North Korea. In reality, the country's status as a nuclear power was enshrined into its constitution in September 2023. A year prior, the country introduced the so-called nuclear law, giving Kim Jong Un the all-decisive powers to authorize preemptive nuclear strikes. Before the new law, North Korea followed a strict no-first-use policy. Now, according to their nuclear law, several circumstances could trigger the preemptive use of these weapons of mass destruction. The problem? These circumstances could be interpreted quite broadly to apply to numerous scenarios. For instance, Kim could launch a preemptive nuclear strike to deter what he perceives as a fatal military attack against important strategic objects. But the key part is that the attack is judged to be on the horizon. Given Kim's proclivity to misjudge even minor situations as potentially catastrophic, this ambiguous statement raises serious concerns. Same goes for the provision of allowing North Korea to use nuclear weapons to gain the upper hand in a war. This provision basically gives the country the green light to use these weapons against a potentially non-nuclear weapon state to take the initiative in war, as the law puts it. Unfortunately, these aren't the only worrying parts of this law. North Korea's nuclear law also states that nuclear missiles can be launched automatically and immediately if Kim's command and control system is placed in danger. The ambiguity surrounding what constitutes a threat to the system, combined with the swift and automatic nature of the response, only further intensifies the potential for unintended escalations and catastrophic outcomes. The changes made during the 9th plenary meeting did nothing to change these troubling provisions. In fact, they only made them much more entrenched in North Korea's official policy by declaring the country is a forever nuclear power, while labeling the US and its allies as its worst threat. That's why it shouldn't be surprising that the changes restated the idea that denuclearizing North Korea is not up for discussion now or ever. Though many experts call these changes to the country's constitution symbolic, Pyongyang's bolstering of its military forces certainly isn't. Unfortunately, North Korea's military reinforcement is very much underway, and it's the third reason experts believe a nuclear war is a growing concern. Somewhere between all the threats and insults hurled during the 9th plenary meeting, Kim found the time also to vow to expand North Korea's weapons arsenal in 2024. Of course, he placed a particular emphasis on the nuclear-capable weapons, declaring North Korea would start producing more nuclear materials. This is especially troubling to hear, considering the considerable progress North Korea has made in multiple areas of nuclear technology. Let's remember, we're talking about one of the most isolated countries in the world, the same country that had exactly 0 nuclear weapons in 2001. If North Korea has managed to build a threatening arsenal of these weapons in a little over 20 years, despite constantly being in the policy crosshairs of every US administration, its nuclear potential ambitions should be a serious cause for global concern. We'll look deeper into North Korea's arsenal a little later in the video. For now, all that you need to know is that this arsenal makes North Korea one of the only 3 countries in the world that could target the US with nuclear weapons. And judging by Kim's vows, the country is only getting started. Unsurprisingly, North Korea isn't exactly shy about its nuclear and arms production capabilities. As mentioned, the country has conducted more than 100 so-called test launches since 2022. Of course, testing these missiles is arguably the last thing on Kim's mind when conducting the launches. Instead, they serve as provocative displays of North Korea's military might and technological advancements. This is also why the increasing frequency of these launches is deemed the 4th and final reason experts are increasingly alarmed about the prospect of a nuclear conflict, especially when considering that one of the latest test launches on December 30, 2023, involved nuclear-capable missiles. To make matters worse, these types of missiles were given to Russia, who then launched them into battle against Ukraine, showing that Kim is growing bolder, more daring, and extending his influence. By now, it should be clear North Korea is preparing for a nuclear war. But why exactly? Let's dissect North Korea's possible motivations and examine factors contributing to its preparations for a potential nuclear war. First and foremost, Kim Jong Un is preparing for a nuclear war because he sees it as the only path to victory in the potential Second Korean War. If this war were to erupt on the Korean peninsula, North Korea's nuclear arsenal would be the only advantage that could tip the balance in Kim's favor. Sure, the Korean People's Army might have more than twice as many active personnel, with 1,280,000 soldiers compared to roughly 555,000 in the Republic of Korea Army, the official name for the South Korean Army. However, North Korea's military equipment is very technologically outdated, with designs that date back to the Soviet era of the 1950s. That's a far cry from the modern military equipment and technology wielded by its southern neighbor. Also, North Korean soldiers are undoubtedly in poorer shape due to the country's chronic malnutrition, which affects up to 74.1% of its population. Crucially, let's not forget that the US would almost certainly intervene in this war, contributing much of its military might to South Korea's side. With the help of its allies, Seoul would be superior to Pyongyang in virtually every way, including weaponry, logistics, and intelligence. However, many experts believe South Korea could hold its own even without a US intervention. That is, of course, if no nuclear weapons are employed in the conflict. After all, South Korea doesn't possess any nuclear weapons. That's why nuclear first use is the best chance for Kim's regime to survive in the war and even potentially win. To do so, Kim would have to employ nuclear weapons pretty early, before the KPA starts losing on the battlefield, which, let's face it, is unavoidable. However, South Korea's allies, led by the US, are well aware a nuclear strike is the only way for North Korea to close the existing conventional military gap and potentially achieve a favorable outcome. So they'll probably try to suppress the country's missiles immediately by carrying out a massive disarming strike against North Korea. If this happens, Allied air power will destroy all northern nuclear weapons, reverting the inter-Korean conflict back to a conventional war, which the North will undoubtedly lose. Frighteningly, the high likelihood of this scenario could have an undesirable and catastrophic consequence. It could push Kim to use his nuclear weapons immediately, almost as soon as the fighting begins. As Kim sees it, it's either use it or lose it, and losing it is not an option for Kim. Why? Because losing the ability to use nuclear weapons would mean losing the war, which would mean, in turn, annihilation for the Kims. South Korea and its allies have every intention of bringing about a regime change in North Korea and annexing its territory. So for Kim, this war threatens the very survival of his dynasty, which has existed for over 70 years. This also is what makes the situation on the Korean peninsula different from that in Ukraine. As a reminder, Russia possesses close to 5,900 nuclear warheads as of 2023, the single largest stockpile in the world, and yet there's no mention of using nuclear weapons in the Russo-Ukrainian war. A possible explanation is that this war isn't existential for Vladimir Putin's regime or the Russian state and territory, but because it is for North Korea, the consequences of defeat are far worse for Kim and his country than for Russia. So the first possible reason behind North Korea's preparation for a nuclear war has to do with South Korea. But let's not forget, there are two countries Kim threatened to thoroughly annihilate. The second is, of course, the US. But why is Kim preparing for a nuclear war against the US when efforts were made to improve relations with the US for almost 30 years, from 1990 to 2019? Kim's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and his father, Kim Jong-il, and Kim himself had conversations with the US. So what changed? To understand this, we have to travel back through history, examining key points in the US-North Korea nuclear talks during those 30 years. The first major move in this department happened on October 21, 1994, when the two countries signed the Agreed Framework. With this agreement, North Korea vowed to freeze and eventually dismantled its graphite-moderated nuclear reactors, which were suspected of being a part of a nuclear weapons program. In return, the US and its allies pledged to provide economic assistance to the country, as well as 2 light water reactors for civilian energy purposes. However, implementing the agreed framework faced challenges, and by the early 2000s, tensions escalated. North Korea accused the new US administration of largely ignoring its initiatives and pulling away from the agreement. At that same time, the US accused North Korea of pursuing a secret uranium enrichment program, violating the spirit of the agreement. These mutual accusations led to the agreed framework falling apart in 2002. However, North Korea wasn't ready to give up, even offering the US unprecedented access to its nuclear facilities at the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center site. Interestingly, this access was offered to Siegfried Hecker, the scientist we mentioned at the beginning of this video. Unfortunately, the distrust between the two nations persisted, leading to a seemingly never-ending cycle of provocations, periods of diplomatic engagement, and then renewed tensions. In 2006, these tensions escalated when North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in North Hamgyong province, producing a small explosion of around 1 kiloton. The test further strained North Korea's relations with the US and the international community, triggering a series of sanctions by the United Nations Security Council. However, despite those sanctions, North Korea continued to build a stockpile of nuclear weapons and delivery systems, producing fissile material and test missiles of all ranges. This fact, together with the 2006 nuclear test, brought into question North Korea's true commitment to denuclearization and peace talks with the US. Many believe that North Korea only used the dialogue between the countries to cover up its nuclear ambitions. The same beliefs persisted during the Obama administration. However, it was the administration of former President Donald Trump that irrevocably crushed any hope of a diplomatic breakthrough between the countries regarding nuclear weapons. This is also when Kim is believed to have abandoned the goal of normalizing relations with the U.S., concluding that he has exhausted all of his diplomatic options. But what exactly happened during the Trump administration to cause such a shift in North Korea's stance? According to many experts, one event put the final nail in the coffin of the diplomatic optimism: the February 2019 Hanoi summit. This was the second one-to-one meeting between Trump and Kim. The first took place in Singapore in 2018 and marked the beginning of Kim's efforts to follow in the footsteps of his father and grandfather when it comes to normalizing relations with the U.S. That's why Kim poured considerable effort into the Hanoi summit, hoping to make progress and potentially secure concessions for North Korea. He even showered Trump with flattery in a letter before the summit in an effort to build rapport and create a favorable atmosphere for negotiations. However, surprising many who feared Trump might be too accommodating, the Hanoi summit ended without a deal. Kim, who spent over 120 hours on a train between Pyongyang and Hanoi, undoubtedly saw this as a colossal loss of face. Kim did not hide his disappointment and shock in his final letter to Trump, the 27th letter exchanged between the two heads of state. This August 2019 letter reflected how much Kim felt he had risked and lost. "If you do not think of our relationship as a stepping stone that only benefits you," Kim wrote, "then you would not make me look like an idiot that will only give without getting anything in return." It's evident that the collapse of the Hanoi summit was a massive blow to Kim's pride, who felt humiliated by the outcome. It's also clear that Kim has never gotten over the emotional impact of the summit, as 2019 marked a massive shift in North Korea's nuclear policy. This was more than just pouting on Kim's part. It represented a strategic recalibration, the first of its kind in almost 30 years. In his eyes, he only had one option: gird himself and the country for war. The first clear sign of this new strategy would come some 3 years later, in 2022, when Kim passed the already mentioned nuclear law. At the time, Kim sent a clear message. There would be absolutely no denuclearization, no negotiation, and no bargaining chip to trade, indicating that denuclearization was no longer even a talking point, let alone an option. Then began the record number of weapons tests by North Korea, beginning in 2022, intending to develop highly advanced missiles that can reach the entire territory of the U.S. However, it's unlikely North Korea will go with nuclear first use when it comes to the U.S. It's more likely North Korea is preparing for a nuclear war in case the more powerful U.S. decides to launch a conventional or nuclear war against it. As for the U.S., Washington has persisted in its readiness to negotiate anywhere, anytime, without preconditions. But Pyongyang has no interest in those negotiations, discarding them as futile. Instead, North Korea has seemingly been looking to reinforce ties with two of the U.S.'s adversaries, Russia and China. In September 2023, Kim met Vladimir Putin at the Russian spaceport Vostochny Cosmodrome, sending another clear message about North Korea's changing alliances. North Korea's closer ties to Russia could be altogether another reason the country is amping up its nuclear war preparations. As we mentioned, Pyongyang is believed to be supplying military equipment to Moscow for its war with Ukraine. In return, Russia's been providing technical support to help North Korea advance its military capabilities, with an emphasis on nuclear weapons. But what about the U.S.-South Korean alliance? We've discussed how South Korea and the U.S. have individually contributed to North Korea's perceived need for war preparations. The truth is that the expansion of the U.S.-South Korean military drills was one of the primary reasons for the increase in North Korea's warlike rhetoric. It's clear that this alliance, or North Korea's fear of it to be precise, is also one of the leading forces of the country's nuclear war preparations. Now, Kim Jong Un is probably well aware North Korea wouldn't survive an all-out nuclear war against the U.S., but even suggesting it is willing to use limited nuclear weapons to challenge the U.S.-South Korean alliance may significantly enhance North Korea's bargaining power on the international stage. For now, we're in the tit-for-tat stage of this bubbling conflict. The U.S. and its allies make a move, North Korea makes a counter-move, and vice versa. In November 2023, North Korea claimed to have launched its first spy satellite intended to monitor its southern neighbor. The South responded by suspending a part of the 2018 military accord between the nations, known as the Comprehensive Military Agreement, concerning surveillance. However, the tit-for-tat moves didn't stop there. North Korea eventually suspended this agreement altogether, thus restoring all previously halted military measures. Then, in December 2023, North Korea resumed missile tests, launching a long-range ballistic missile capable of flying over 9,000 miles and thus reaching the entire US. This was just one of the record 36 test launches in 2023. Unfortunately, Kim has shown no signs of slowing down, as 2024 has already seen 4 test launches, including one in January 2024. While the US, South Korea, and Japan carried out joint military drills, North Korea responded by testing its HIL-523 nuclear-capable underwater attack drones off its east coast. And what country lies off North Korea's east coast? Japan, of course. As previously mentioned, these tests spell massive trouble when it comes to nuclear war preparation, especially when you consider that many of the tested missiles can carry nuclear warheads. Now that we know the why and the how, let's examine the what. Let's take a look at North Korea's nuclear arsenal to understand the type of threat the country poses on the global stage. According to the Institute for Science and International Security, North Korea could have anywhere between 31 and 96 nuclear warheads. Such a broad estimate makes sense when you consider the secretive nature of North Korea's nuclear program and all the challenges associated with gathering accurate intelligence in the country. One thing is known, however: North Korea has tested the effectiveness of its nuclear weapons on 6 occasions, and the most recent, the 2017 detonation at the Punggiri test site, has been the most worrying by far. Why? Because the explosion had an estimated force ranging from 100 to 370 kilotons. To understand just how insane these figures are, all you need to know is that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 had yields of 15 and 21 kilotons respectively. The 2017 nuclear test also caused a magnitude 6.3 earthquake and produced sound waves recorded by seismometers worldwide. Another worrying development in the North Korean nuclear saga is the successful testing of the Hwasong-18, the intercontinental ballistic missile with an estimated range of 9,000 miles. This missile can travel as fast as 19,000 miles per hour, more than 55 times the speed of sound. And the last outright terrifying fact about this missile: the Hwasong-18 can carry 3 or 4 warheads instead of 1. It's not looking too good for anyone on the receiving end of that missile, is it? While the Hwasong-18's impressive specs might give you pause, keeping things in perspective is essential. Let's not forget that the US has over 5,000 nuclear warheads, the second largest stockpile in the world. Of course, the US also has hundreds of Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles with an operational range of almost 9,000 miles and a maximum speed of 17,500 miles per hour. In other words, the US can easily match North Korea missile for missile. The US's impressive nuclear arsenal might also be one of the strongest deterrents against potential conflicts. There's also the expected lack of support for North Korea from China, which seemingly prefers to maintain the status quo. After all, disrupting the stability of the Korean peninsula, however fragile it might be, is in no way in the country's best interest. Now check out How Cruel is North Korean Leader Kim Jong Un and more Life Inside North Korea stories, or watch this instead.